So by way of showing how one particular site looks at difficult history, I wanted to take you to the Topaz Museum and Internment Camp site in Delta, Utah. The camp itself is located outside of the town of Delta, and the museum, which is separate from the site, is located in town. The museum began in 1991 when a family donated a portion of a recreation hall from the site, and an ad hoc committee was formed to restore the structure. This was done, and the new structure was dedicated in 1994. After that, the ad hoc committee became a more formalized board, purchased the land of the camp, and then created a National Historic Landmark in 2007, and then went on to form the museum in 2015. I had the opportunity to tour Topaz last year at this time while attending the Oral History Association meetings in Salt Lake City. And I just wanted to share with you a tour of the site and the interpretation at the museum and the site itself, which I experienced. First, a little background. As you may know, Japanese internment has its origins in the early months of World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt declared Executive Order 9066, which ordered the evacuation of citizens from military areas. Specifically in this case, an exclusion area along the west coast of the United States. Although this order could have applied more broadly, General DeWitt, who ran the relocation effort, basically applied it only to those of Japanese descent. Now, Topaz was populated by people almost exclusively from the San Francisco Bay Area. Originally, they were detained at an assembly center in Tanforan at the racetrack and barracked in the stables, and eventually transferred to Topaz, located in the high desert of western Utah at the foot of the mountains. Now, most of the camps were themselves like small cities with everything, not only barracks and mess halls, latrines, cultural centers, and other kinds of activities. This is what Topaz looked like after it was constructed, when it was populated in the beginning months of the war. Most of these camps, all of these camps, were disassembled after the war, and in fact, many of the buildings were repurposed as houses in the surrounding communities, and this is absolutely the case in Delta. When you drive around the town, you can see a number of houses that are formerly hospitals and barracks and recreation halls from the camp. At some other camps like Manzanar, there are a few vestigial buildings preserved. At Topaz, there are none. So you begin your experience in the museum, which is located in the town of Delta itself. As I mentioned, it was largely the creation of motivated locals who were also the primary interpreters of the site. The two docents we interacted with were both from Delta, and both had grown up during the camp's operations. One woman's father worked at the camp as a director, and another's father did business with the camp and hired internees. Before going through the exhibit, we viewed an orientation video and also heard from the local residents. Both shared stories about how the presence of the camp had been naturalized in their community. One guy mentioned that he didn't even know what the camp was until he was in high school and did research on it for a paper. And it was clear that for both of them, creating and maintaining the museum was a way of redressing the silences and wrongs of their community's past. The exhibits at the museum had several striking features from the point of view of interpreting difficult history. First, they struck a balanced humanistic tone that emphasized both the injustice of internment, but also the resilience and creativity of those who were interned. The exhibits foreground the voices and experiences of internees through oral history and also through internee artwork. And finally, the exhibit does not let the visitor remain a detached observer. The script routinely offers us questions that move us to address issues of complicity and response, and urge us to make connections to the present time and consider the legacy of Topaz for American history then and now. So the exhibit starts with executive order and removal, and we see artifacts related to displacement and evacuation, relocation, suitcases, ID cards, and other artifacts related to life at Tanforan. The emphasis here is on loss of property, of dignity, of rights. For example, in this section of the exhibit, we see an image of two Japanese American girls who are being relocated. You can see the tag that's hanging off of their coats, and we see those actual tags here off to the right hanging, but we also see this kind of imprint of numbers on the girls' faces, and these were actual numbers that were assigned to evacuees when they were removed. And then, of course, we have the tags here hanging. And this is one of the first areas where we are asked a question by the text. If an order went up tomorrow telling you to report to a detention center, what would you do? And here we're also getting to see us moving into the fact that this was a specific group that was targeted. What if the order only applied to people you didn't know? So what if this happened today? The exhibit goes on to talk about the forced nature of the removal, and in particular the loss of property. So people were not only detained, but people lost their homes, their businesses, their farms, all of the things that they owned, and many did not regain these after the war. Again, the text asks us to think about this. The Constitution assures certain rights. Why then did forced removal happen? And the exhibit also asks us to think about the fact that removal was not opposed by other Americans, and that in fact was allowed to go forward on the assumption of Japanese otherness. The exhibit then moves into a series of cases that talk about evacuation, specifically things that people took with them and were forced to leave behind, things that were confiscated, and then also the nature of life at the racetrack at Tanforan, what it was like to live there. And here are some examples of household objects and things that people had to live with. We then move into the camps themselves. This is the plan for Topaz, and there's like a relief map that you can look at and interact with. And then we're taken into an area that is a kind of reconstructed barracks, representing the living conditions of the Kami family. And here, the space and the script emphasize the kind of bare bones nature of the space, not only that it was very small for the family, but also that they didn't really have all that much. And we see little interesting touches here, the wood stove, which would have been the only source of heat in the dead of winter, but then also we see here the baseball, glove, bat, and ball, again underscoring the American identity of those who were detained, even though they were citizens. We also see bedding that's stamped with the Wartime Relocation Authority logo, and personal objects such as the shrine and the baseball uniform. Another section talks about the relationship between the town of Delta and the camp itself, telling the story of one internee who was hired to work at a local newspaper as a typesetter. And in fact, I believe the woman who was one of the docents that we talked to that day, her father had been the owner of the newspaper who hired a Mr. Yasuda. Another major area of the exhibit counters the sense of deprivation with an emphasis on the creativity and resourcefulness of internees. So we see handmade furniture, crafts, and artwork. Also crafts and artwork made with what was at hand, including shells that were the remnants of a prehistoric lake that originally was located at the foot of the mountains, as well as fine artwork. Now, Topaz is unique because it had so many artists who lived there, and that was partly because of the way in which a lot of the community institutions of the Bay Area were transplanted almost in whole into the camp. Chiro Obata, who was a well-known artist and the head of an art school in San Francisco, was interned at Topaz and continued his work running an art school at the camp. As a result, there were several important artists who emerged from Topaz, including Mine Okubo, who wrote the graphic memoir Citizen 13660, which is a graphic account of her experience at Topaz, illustrated by her. And their artwork was an important lens into life in the camp. One incident that was recorded by Obata himself was the murder of James Wasaka, who was killed as he walked along the camp fence and mistaken for an escapee. And his funeral is shown here on the right. Now, as I mentioned, this text, this script and the exhibit design does not allow us to remain neutral as we go through. So we are routinely throughout the course of the exhibit asked specific questions and kind of pushed in the position of reflecting on the legacy of Topaz. So for instance, in one section about racism and immigration, we're asked, how should our country decide which immigrants to welcome? At the end of the exhibit, there's a whole wall that focuses on the issue of constitutional rights, and we're shown the specific rights that were violated by internment. We're also shown explicit statements about the fact that the Constitution didn't support Japanese American citizens. And then we're asked, will you stand up to protect someone else's civil rights? Again, asking us to think about what would we do if this happened today. Again, there's also an emphasis on, without really saying never again, we are asked to think about the conditions that made internment possible and make connections to the prejudices and conflicts of our own time. As this one panel points out, this did not occur in a foreign country under tyrannical dictatorship. It happened in America, right? And then we're told democracy requires action. And could an injustice like Topaz happen again in our country? And this is one of the last questions that the exhibit leaves you with. So you're really taken away like, what were the conditions that made this happen? What do we need to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again? Outside the museum, there's the surviving recreation hall that was restored and rededicated in 1994. And you can go here and see what this was like inside. This is, again, the original building. And we can see how on the bottom left-hand corner, this is the way the camp itself was laid out. So you can kind of see where that recreation hall would have fit in. And this was very typical of the design of the camps, with these barracks around a central latrine and mess hall, with a recreation area hall or a school off to the side. After the visit to the museum, you can travel to the site itself, which is now a ruin. Stepping off the bus, I was overwhelmed by a sense of desolation. We were really in the middle of nowhere. It was fall, so it wasn't necessarily super cold yet, but there was a wind that was blowing most of the time. And you could really kind of imagine what this would have been like in the wintertime with that cold wind and how the snow everywhere and just how totally desolate this place would have felt. The signage is minimal. There's a few vestiges of historic gateways and so forth, and then this sign that was mounted when the site became a historic landmark. And there's a small memorial area there right off of the main gate. And here we have the National Historic Landmark designation as well. The primary interpretation as you go through the site is from the docent, one of the town residents I mentioned before, whose father worked at the camp. And we walk through the ruins. He points out the significance of what we're seeing on the landscape, mostly debris, pipes, broken plaster, screens also rusted, a lot of nails everywhere. And we were told that this is from the period in which the camp was constructed. They were building so fast and in such a hurry that when the nails were dropped, they just left them there and kept working. So there's rusty nails everywhere, as well as weather-worn wood. There's also the remnants of the camp structures themselves, primarily the foundations, and then also, in the case of the latrines, some of the plumbing. This is a women's latrine and bathhouse, and then this is the foundation from a mess hall. There are also punctuated throughout the site the surviving components of many of the rock gardens and sculptures that were made by residents who lived here. Again, a sign of the creativity that they exercised. Many internees kept gardens, Japanese-style gardens outside of their barracks. At Manzanar, there was a very elaborate traditional Japanese garden, complete with pond and fish. And some internees did keep little ponds with fish in their household gardens. I don't know if that was the case at Topaz. The weather at Topaz would have made that kind of larger style of Japanese garden probably impossible. But people did manage to do something, and this sketch here in the middle is one that Obata himself did of one of the doorway gardens outside of a barracks. And then these are also some remnants of these gardens here, a part of a doorway, and then this is, we believe, the remnants of the edge of a small pond or a retaining wall. Another culturally significant trace is this mochi bowl, which was used for pounding rice to make Japanese rice cakes. And here we have a kind of vestigial one here that's been damaged, but there's also an example of one in the exhibit, and this is what it would have looked like. So again, traces of the culture, traces of the humanity of the people who were here. There are a few signs around the site that mark other sites, such as the main gate, the guard towers, and here on the right, an elementary school, Mountain View Elementary. And then also we see that some of the barracks are marked. Now this is important because here again is the original map of the site, and you can see how the barracks were laid out in relation to the other buildings, and then you can go actually on the ruined site itself and locate yourself in the geography. So here we have block 1-42. Now this is important because it allows you to kind of get a sense of where you are in the ruined landscape. But it's also important because what it allows the staff at Topaz to do is take survivors of internment and their descendants on tours of the site, and then they can locate by consulting camp records and then the map and visiting the site, they can locate the specific barracks that their family lived in. And this is a really important form of reconciliation, mourning, and healing for these legacy visitors, and clearly also very important to those who run the museum as well. In this way, the site allows for an address of trauma, confirms the reality of internment, and also supports intergenerational memory. And this is just a bit of poetry from the exhibit.